Hi everyone, we're continuing on with lecture 26. Moving into 26B, the epidemiology and public health implications of human papillomavirus. So first I want to start by showing you some data from the era before the currently available vaccine had been invented and approved for use. So most of you received Gardasil, which is the HPV vaccine. You would have gotten it probably when you were around 11. It's a series of 3 injections. But before that vaccine was available, we used to see a lot of HPV. So this is data from the CDC from 2003-2004. This is that National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey where researchers go out and knock on people's doors and say, hello, may I draw your blood and swab your vagina and do all these things to find out what the actual prevalence of certain conditions is. They go all over the country every few years to do these tests. So back in 2003-2004, we found that in your age group, so people aged 20 to 24, about 30% of them were positive for HPV. So the dark blue is the non-oncogenic, the genital wart HPV, and then the light blue is the oncogenic type. And so a lot of people had this virus. It was really, really common. I also want to show you something that's different about this particular chart as we think about when we looked at similar prevalence data for the herpes virus. And so in the herpes virus, you might remember things just went up over time as more and more people had been exposed to the virus. But in this case, we actually see a gradual decrease in prevalence with age. So this is very different, and this is due to the fact that HPV is alone among the 3 main viral STIs, right? So we have HIV, HSV, which is herpes, and HPV. HPV is unique in that people seem to clear the virus on their own, right? So we can see here, I've just kind of replicated that chart, and you can see that as people age, the prevalence decreases, as opposed to herpes, where as with age, the prevalence just increases, and since you never clear it, then once you've got it, you always have it. So there's a definite difference there. This is a study that was really interesting, and which is why I want to share it with you, also from 2003. So this study was conducted at a university in the Pacific Northwest. They enrolled freshmen, female-bodied people. And so the participants in this study kept a weekly diary of all their sexual activity, and they had vaginal swabs performed every 2 weeks to test for HPV. So really intensive study, a lot of data. And so what they found, so what we're looking at here in this image is the cumulative incidence. So this is the number of people who at any time tested positive for HPV. And so what we can see is freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, senior year, super seniors, right? So by the time most people ended the study, right, more than 60% of them had been infected with HPV. So this is a very common viral infection that we used to see quite a lot of, right? Interestingly, in that study, the only people who never tested positive for HPV, and they were looking specifically for oncogenic HPV on the cervix in this particular study, were the people who never had vaginal receptive intercourse, makes sense, and the people who always use condoms 100% of the time if they did have intercourse. So condoms actually are very protective, as we would expect, because it requires direct transmission to that squamocolumnar junction. So what about now? You are living in the vaccine era, and this is a huge success. This vaccine is incredibly effective at preventing HPV infections. So we can see overall prevalence in the pre-vaccine era. This is in ages 14 to 19, and then the higher bar is ages 20 to 24. So that's back before the vaccine in this particular study. And then look at that significant decrease after the vaccine. right? Now, this is of all comers, right? So some of these people didn't get the vaccine. I would also add that the initial vaccine used had 4 subtypes that it covered and protected people against. We currently have a vaccine that protects you against 9 different subtypes. So some of the infections that we were still seeing were in people who were not vaccinated, or they were people who were vaccinated but got exposed to different subtypes. But hugely dramatic decreases in this infection. It's been amazing. So we have the HPV vaccine now. It's recommended for all young people, boys and girls at age 11. We initially had that quadrivalent vaccine, which had 4 subtypes, but now we have the 9-valent, which protects against the 2 main wart subtypes, or non-oncogenic, and against 80% of the oncogenic or cancer-causing, potentially cancer-causing subtypes. So that's been a huge game changer. Condoms, as I mentioned, are also very effective at preventing transmission of those oncogenic strains, right? As we saw in that study from the Pacific Northwest. Now, they're not necessarily as effective for preventing warts, right? Those non-oncogenic ones, because it depends on where they are. Obviously, if the warts are on the shaft of the penis and it's covered by the condom, it's going to be completely effective. But sometimes those warts can be in places that aren't covered by a condom. So it's a little less helpful, but can be very helpful still. What about screening tests? So there is a test for the virus. We can do a PCR test to look for the presence of the virus. But the problem is, right, most people aren't going to have any harm from this virus. Most people, it's going to go away on its own. So as a medical provider, I don't want to know everybody who has it, right? Especially back in the day when like most people had it at one point in time. What I really care about as a medical provider is who is at risk for potentially getting cancer over time. So instead of doing an HPV test, I'm more interested in a test to look for signs that somebody might have that oncogenic HPV and that it is causing them problems. So I'm going to be looking for what we call precancerous changes in their cells. And the way we do that is with a test called the Pap smear or the Pap test, named after Dr. Papanicolaou, who actually was a zoologist who emigrated to this country to flee persecution, and he studied reproductive cycles in hamsters. But that's a story for another day. All right, so the Pap smear, we do a speculum exam to look inside the vagina and then use a long-handled brush and swirl it around the cervix to collect a few cells, just kind of brush a few cells off the surface of the cervix and send it into the lab so they can look at those cells and see, do they look normal or do they look potentially precancerous? So there's a link in the description, which is a video of somebody getting a Pap smear. It's not graphic, but you can just kind of see the whole procedure. It's also kind of bizarre because she's dressed like a fairy, and I don't really know what's going on there, but it was the only video I could find that was kind of brief and to the point, and I thought it kind of showed you what an office visit for a Pap smear goes like, but it is bizarre with the magic wand and the wings. So my apologies for that. All right, if the Pap smear is abnormal, then sometimes we'll just monitor that over time and see if it gets better on its own, which it often will. Or if it doesn't and we find some precancerous cells that are persisting or getting worse, we can just remove those precancerous cells, kind of like getting a funny mole taken off at the dermatologist's office. And ever since we invented Pap smears or started doing Pap smear screening for cervical cancer, we've had a significant decrease in the number of cases of cervical cancer in this country. So it used to be up around 40,000, which is not in this particular graph. And now we're actually, this one stopped at 2010, we're actually now way below this. So we've seen significant decreases in cervical cancer because of the introduction of Pap smear screening. So when we think about HPV screening in general, remember our regular screening questions to see if it would be effective. Is the condition common? In the case of HPV, it certainly was, especially before the vaccine. It's still relatively common. Can the condition be serious? Yes, you can get cervical cancer. Is there a good test? Well, Yeah, the pap smear is a really good test. And is there safe, effective treatment available? Yes. So when it comes to screening, we don't recommend the HPV test, right? Because we're not going to treat those people. We used to back in the olden days, and then we realized we didn't need to because they were going to clear it on their own anyway. It was a big whoops. Right? But we are going to do pap smears. And so we start them at age 21, not before. Cervical cancer is basically unheard of before age 21 in female-bodied people because it takes 10 years for this to develop. So there are very rare cases when it can develop earlier than age 21, but in the general population, we don't start until then. And then it's just every 3 years. We used to do it every year, and then we found out that wasn't necessary because we were finding things that were going to heal up on their own and exposing people to unnecessary treatment. We don't yet have a routinely recommended screening test in men, although a lot of men who have sex with men are being screened with anal pap tests, and there's lots of studies going on to see if that is effective, and it's looking like it probably will be. So lots of clinics do that now. So summary for HPV, right? The non-oncogenic subtypes infect the skin, cause genital warts, but will go away over time. The oncogenic subtypes infect the squamocolumnar junction, and in most people will clear within 3 years, but in some people can go on to cause cancer if it's not detected and treated. They're both transmitted by direct contact, but one is skin to skin, one is penetration. For prevention, condoms help, more so for oncogenic than the non. Vaccine is highly effective. I can't even tell you. We used to get so many abnormal pap smears, and now it hardly ever happens. We used to get like dozens and dozens a year. Now we maybe get 1 or 2 a year. It's amazing. And so screening test, right, is the pap smear.